Good morning, and thank you for being with us today. After reviewing this matter in full, I've decided to have a press conference to provide an update on the status of the Kevin Ferguson filing. The video that you're about to watch received national media attention and was widely shared on social media when the incident took place in the city of Anaheim back in February of last year. Since that time, we've continued to receive calls and letters inquiring about the status of this case. I feel the need to warn you in advance that this video is very uncomfortable to watch. It's graphic in not only the actions taken, but in the language used by Kevin Ferguson, a 33-year-old off-duty police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department, who profanely confronted a female juvenile for cutting across his property. Apparently, this was an ongoing concern for the Fergusons who lived near his school. The young girl was one of 4 students walking home in a group that day. A verbal exchange occurred between Ferguson and the juveniles. As you'll hear in the video, at one point Ferguson called the young girl a very offensive and derogatory term, at which time one of the male juveniles who she was walking with came to her defense, pointing out the inappropriateness of Ferguson's behavior and conduct. The incident continued to escalate and lasted for approximately 16 minutes until Anaheim police officers arrived on the scene. Before turning this over to Assistant District Attorney Brahim Beytai of the Special Prosecutions Unit, who is going to show you the video and some additional details, it's important to point out that we have a moral and ethical obligation to file only those charges that are supported by evidence and can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. It's also important to understand that we do not have jurisdiction over the discipline of police officers in the police agencies. And so, in this case, we'll defer to Los Angeles Police Department to answer any questions about that. Central to the case at hand are 2 issues. Does the evidence establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Ferguson did not have a legal right to detain John Doe? And second, does the evidence establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Ferguson used an unreasonable amount of force while detaining John Doe, assuming that he had a right to do so? I'll now turn this over to Brahim, who will provide additional context and detail. This is going to take a while. I think we estimate that it might take about 35 minutes. That includes an 11-minute video. Brahim.
Good morning. Our review in this process started as a result of the Anaheim Police Department conducting an investigation and turning over to our office reports, videos, interviews, and documentation relating to this incident. Our finding is expressly limited to 2 determinations. The first determination, we had to make a decision if we have sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kevin Ferguson did not have a right to detain John Doe. The second prong, the second part of our evaluation was whether or not Kevin Ferguson, if he had the right to detain John Doe, used unreasonable or excessive force in effectuating that detention. There are mainly 2 individuals, 2 principals involved in this incident. The first one is the suspect, Kevin Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson was 33 years old at the time of this incident. He resided in the city of Anaheim, and he was an off-duty LAPD officer. I mentioned that to you because our evaluation did not treat him as a police officer doing something under the color of authority. We treated him as a civilian citizen engaged in an incident that was submitted to our office for review. The relevance of his status as an off-duty police officer relates to his ability to carry a concealed weapon. Because as you will find out during this incident, Mr. Ferguson was carrying a concealed weapon, and he used that weapon during the later end of that altercation. So he was in lawful possession of that weapon. He had the right to possess it and carry it concealed on his body as a result of his status of being a peace officer with the city of LA. The second principal in this incident is a minor. We are going to refer to him as a John Doe. He was 13 years old at the time, a male that went to school close by to where Mr. Ferguson lived at the time. The incident took place on February 21st, 2017, a Tuesday at about 2:38 in the afternoon. At that time, John Doe and 3 of his friends were walking home from school. The 4 individuals, 4 minors, were 2 males and 2 females. Mr. Ferguson confronted a female friend of John Doe as she walked in his front yard. And in confronting her, he called her a very vulgar and derogatory name, a name that most reasonable people will tell you no woman should ever be called that name, let alone 13-year-old child. Mr. Ferguson used that term in describing the female child. As a result of that, John Doe confronted Mr. Ferguson, told him, you should not be treating a woman like this. That kind of escalated into a verbal altercation, words being exchanged between Mr. Ferguson and John Doe and his friends, as John Doe and his friends were walking away from Mr. Ferguson's house. They were walking away from his house. At the time, Mr. Ferguson was dressed as a civilian. He was not wearing a uniform, and he was acting in his capacity as a civilian. Mr. Ferguson claims that John Doe told him, if you touch me, I'm going to shoot you. Okay, so that's the claim that was made by Mr. Ferguson. You're going to hear that on the video. So this is not a claim that he made subsequently. From the time of the incident, that's what Mr. Ferguson is saying, that you told me you're going to shoot me. On the other hand, John Doe was saying that he said, if you touch me, I'm going to sue you. So it's, if you touch me, I'm going to shoot you, versus if you touch me, I'm going to sue you. We believe the evidence is going to show, and it showed us, that thinking that John Doe said shoot versus sue is not unreasonable based on all the circumstances. You're going to get to hear some of it on the video. And Anaheim PD, during their extensive investigation, they interviewed anybody and everybody that they could find. There isn't anything that we asked them to do that they didn't do. There isn't part of the investigation that you would expect a good police agency to do that they did not do. They did that. They did everything that we asked them to do and more. They were able to find all kind of videos relating to the incident. They were able to find individuals that did not want to talk to the police, and they found them and they talked to them and obtained a statement from them. So what escalated this incident from a verbal altercation to a physical altercation is Mr. Ferguson deciding that he heard, if you touch me, I'm going to shoot you, and therefore he wanted to place John Doe under private person's arrest. John Doe all along have said, I didn't say I'm going to shoot you, I said I'm going to sue you. The investigation uncovered that the way John Doe speaks leads to a conclusion that sometimes a reasonable person can hear sue to sound like shoo or shoot. And you will see that as we play the video. As a result of Mr. Ferguson hearing that statement by John Doe, he decided that he's going to detain him, and he started following him. At that time, John Doe, again, there is a verbal altercation. John Doe and his friends are moving away. The friends of John Doe are trying to push him away, to kind of move away from Mr. Ferguson's residence. Mr. Ferguson decides to pursue John Doe to detain him. And he also told his dad, and we're going to talk about that, to call 911 as that altercation was progressing. Ferguson started to aggressively pursue John Doe. The first physical contact, the first time Mr. Ferguson laid a hand on John Doe, was about 2 houses west of Mr. Ferguson's house, Mr. Ferguson's residence. John Doe continued to try to get away from Mr. Ferguson, as Mr. Ferguson was trying to continue to detain him. A few times, as a matter of fact, John Doe was able to get away from Mr. Ferguson, and unfortunately, unwisely, Mr. Ferguson decided to continue to pursue him and to try to kind of keep a hold on him. During that time, and you'll see that on the video, Mr. Ferguson kicks John Doe in the groin area, which kind of starts escalating that physical altercation between John Doe and Mr. Ferguson. The 3 times that John Doe was able to free himself, Mr. Ferguson pursued him, recaptured him. There was a time when he puts him in a rear chokehold, trying to continue keeping him under control as he was waiting for the police to arrive. During the time that Mr. Ferguson's father called 911, as a matter of fact, at one time, Mr. Ferguson himself takes the phone, talks to the dispatcher, and requests that they go there immediately. He uses the term code 3, requesting that they respond to the scene immediately to assist him. By that time, a crowd of students from 2 neighboring schools started gathering around the incident as Ferguson was trying to maintain control of John Doe. The students were yelling at Mr. Ferguson to let go of John Doe, telling him to let him go, let him go. John Doe was asking Mr. Ferguson to let him go. As this incident was starting to escalate, at some moment in time, there were about 14 students surrounding Mr. Ferguson and John Doe. And what Mr. Ferguson did, he started moving John Doe towards an area where there is a hedge. And you will see it close to a residence. Because more students were approaching John Doe and Mr. Ferguson is grabbing on to John Doe, bringing him back towards that hedge area. John Doe was being held by Mr. Ferguson as another student. We're going to refer to him as John Doe 2. And as you probably figured out by now, the reason why we're not using their names because they're minors and they're juveniles, and we want to respect their privacy as minors and juveniles. So that's why we're referring to them as John Doe 2, John Doe 3, and John Doe 4. We know who these individuals are. We're not referring to them as a John Doe because we don't know who they are. We've interviewed them, the Anaheim PD interviewed them, we have statements from them, and we have video showing their conduct at the scene. John Doe 2 is about a 15-year-old juvenile, approaches Mr. Ferguson and John Doe. By that time, Mr. Ferguson is holding on to John Doe by the hedge. A bunch of students are surrounding them. And you will see it to some degree. John Doe 2 approaches calmly. He puts his backpack on the ground. He approaches them, and he's trying to get Mr. Ferguson to let go of John Doe. And he physically starts touching Ferguson to trying to get him to stop holding on to John Doe. At the same time, he wasn't successful. At the same time, another juvenile, about 16 years old, we're going to refer to him as John Doe 3, you will see him on the video, starts rushing Mr. Ferguson in a tackling motion, and he kind of tackles him over the hedge as Mr. Ferguson was still holding on to John Doe. As that was happening, during that process, John Doe 2, the individual that initially approached Mr. Ferguson, throws a punch, and he punches Mr. Ferguson in the face, and you will see that on the video. Right after the tackling and that punching motion, another juvenile, we're going to refer to him as a John Doe 4, you will see him jumping over the hedge, and you're going to notice when he jumps over the hedge, he has a pen or a pencil behind his ear. And he immediately jumps over the hedge, and he's within about 4 or 5 feet away from Mr. Ferguson, who's still holding on to John Doe. No weapons drawn at the time. He's just still holding on to John Doe. Mr. John Doe 4 jumps over the fence, and you will see over the hedge. You will see him reach behind his ear, grab a pen or a pencils, and in this motion, he puts it behind his back, in his back pocket. And you will see that, and you will see the distance as he's approaching Mr. Ferguson with his hand behind, reaching out to his back pocket. At that time, Mr. Ferguson, and you will see it on the video, will be able to show you specifically, he's looking directly at John Doe 4. He's been punched, tackled first, and then punched, and John Doe 4 is reaching towards his back. That's when you see Mr. Ferguson reach towards the front of his waistband and Mr. Ferguson and takes out his gun. While still maintaining control over John Doe, he takes out his gun, and one shot was fired. And you're going to see that, and you're going to hear that. Witnesses who observed the incident said that Mr. Ferguson shot in a downward motion towards the ground area. The physical struggle between Mr. Ferguson and John Doe lasted for about 16 minutes until the Anaheim Police Department officers arrived at the scene. When the Anaheim police officers arrived at the scene, one of them approached, and you will see Mr. Ferguson puts his hands up, and the same thing with John Doe, and they're approaching them. And Mr. Ferguson makes a statement to the police officer that he popped one shot into the ground as a warning shot. I should tell you that the Anaheim Police Department did everything they could to try to recover the projectile. Unfortunately, they were not able to recover it because of the location, the shrubbery, and the grass area. They did look. They did multiple attempts to try to find it, but we have not been able to recover the bullet that was fired by Mr. Ferguson at the time. Now, as I mentioned to you, Mr. Ferguson gave a brief statement to the Anaheim police officers who arrived at the scene. Subsequently, when we attempted to interview him and obtain more statements from him, ask him follow-up questions, he refused to provide a statement to the Anaheim Police Department. And just like any other suspect, he had a lawyer by that time. If somebody refuses to give a statement, they have a right to invoke their right to remain silent and not give a statement. There were multiple videos that we're going to show you, about 12 minutes, but we're going to release to you everything that we have relating to the incident. So there were civilian videos that were recorded by mostly students with their cell phones. These recordings have audio as well as video. We also had access through the Anaheim Police Department to residential surveillance videos. Those don't have audio, but they have video. They tend to be better quality, so you'll get to see that. And it's that video that shows the altercation from the beginning. Actually, you'll be able to see in the beginning, before any physical altercation took place between Mr. Ferguson and John Doe, as Mr. Ferguson starts kind of pursuing John Doe as the friends of John Doe are pushing him away. So this is when it was a verbal altercation, and you'll see it develop into a physical altercation. We're going to show you about 12 minutes of the video that we believe is relevant and encompasses what was very pertinent to our determination. However, by the end of this press conference, you'll have access to the entire 39-minute videos that we have. We're going to post them on our website, and you're welcome to go and see them. But we believe the 12-minute that we're going to show you right now will encompass the portions that are pertinent to the investigation. Please note, initially, there's not going to be any audio, because that's going to be the surveillance from the residences. But when we switch to the cell phone videos, that will have audio in it as well.
Recording this, right?
Please, videotape this, please.
Hey, I'm recording, right?
How are you going towards Palm Lane?
He didn't do shit.
We're at the light in front of Loera.
Stop resisting. You stop. You're not gonna
Okay,
stop.
hurry, please.
Leave him alone.
Dude,
You don't have a badge, kid.
stop. You're choking me.
Record this,
No,
please.
you stop.
Record it.
Leave me alone.
Because they're the one that's calling the cops on us and we didn't even do anything.
What are you doing this for?
I don't know what he's doing this
Why am
for.
I doing it?
Hey, stop choking
Because he
him.
threatened to shoot me.
I didn't shoot that.
Where's
What are
the gun
you lying?
then?
You fucking
Yep.
liar.
Where's the gun? Where's the
You're a
weapon?
I
liar.
know exactly.
Where's the
You're
weapon?
fucked
Get out of here. Just get out of here. I don't want you to get in trouble.
Get him alone.
Go ahead.
Leave him
Don't hit her.
alone.
I swear you fucking hit her. I'm gonna kill your ass.
Christian, stop saying that.
You choking me. What the hell?
Hold on your sweater.
No,
You're
you
choking
You
him.
tackled me. You hurt me. You did everything to me.
Recording,
I can
recording,
show
recording.
Don't worry, wait till my brother comes.
I can
Recording
sue
on
you
the
for this.
video.
You know this? I can sue you for this. Fucking harassing me.
Yeah, you probably can. So I'm just gonna wait here.
They're the
for
one
you.
that's calling the cops on us for doing nothing. All I did was walk through their freaking stupid drive-thru, and then he started telling me, he's like, "What the fuck, you bitch? Why you walking through my freaking drive-thru?" I was like, "I'm getting on the sidewalk." He's like, "Get the fuck on my sidewalk." And then I was on the sidewalk, and I was just staring at him.
You choked
And then,
Leave him alone.
Stop moving.
Hey, let him go.
me alone.
Bro, you ain't no fucking cop though.
Oh, let's let him. Let's let him. Fool, that fool can't let him. Let me record this shit. This fool's gonna get busted.
Leave him alone.
Cam, you talk.
No. I'm asking you politely.
Hey, bro, let me have my stuff back.
There. Hey.
I didn't see it. I don't have a clue.
Look, he's an adult. He's hitting a little kid.
You need to get an officer.
He's in junior high.
Hey, where's my gun?
I got this shit on tape.
I heard it. I heard it. I was there.
I didn't.
We were walking by.
And your little friend there is throwing threats at my son. This little girl walked through my driveway.
You're the one who got jumped, not me. You're starting on this.
Hey, help him out. Help him out.
Back up right now.
Hey, help him out, Jalen. This shit is ridiculous. Let go.
They try hitting me with my nuts. That's just freaking. That's like a little pussy move. Punch a kid in the nuts. Fight like a man if you're actually gonna fight a kid, don't you think? That's how you put someone on your own side? You're too weak. Stop grabbing me. Stop grabbing me. Stop grabbing. My hands are gonna be red. So they're red. You just scratched me. No, I wasn't. You tackled me first. I didn't do anything to hurt you. All I said was respect the girl. Because you said get out of my property, you piece of cunt.
You said you shouldn't have made the threat that you were going to shoot me.
I didn't say that. I didn't shoot you.
Bro, you didn't go listen to me. Leave him.
Get your fucking hand off. Get your fucking hand off me.
Get your fucking hands off me then. That's what I thought. You thought you get your hands off me? Get off me. They already got the car. Get off me for the last time. You're like 30 something. I'm only like freaking 13.
That's fucked up.
Let me go. You're stretching on my shirt. I know. You know that. Let me go. No. Are you freaking trying to be here? You hit me so much. You tackled me on the ground. Why did you tackle me? You're a cop, but you're not a cop. Yeah. Tackle me. If you hurt me, saying that I'm going to shoot you and everything, I said I'm going to shoot you. Can't you hear?
Yeah, I heard you.
Then why are you grabbing onto me still? You back up. You're the one who's hurting me.
Hey!
Oh, hey, what the fuck? Yo me no. What the fuck?
Why did you tackle him?
I don't know.
How do you think you are? Tackle me and freaking hurt me? Saying that I'm going to shoot you and everything. Then I said I'm going to shoot you. Can't you hear?
Yeah, I heard you.
Then why are you grabbing onto me still?
Back up. Back up.
You back up. You're the one who's hurting me.
Let's get him out, bro. Let's help him.
Hey!
Oh shit! Fucking. Oh shit.
Hey, how you choking him?
Hey, bro, leave him. Hey, bro, he's a kid. Let him go. Hey, bro, chill. Oh shit.
Hey,
What the fuck? This was a gun. Oh fuck. Nigga has a gun.
You put a gun in my face. What the hell? You put a gun in my Go. Are you freaking trying to be good? You hit me so much. You tackled me on the ground. I understand if you're a cop, but you're not a cop. Yeah. Who the hell do you think you are? Tackle me and freaking hurt me? Saying that I'm going to shoot you and everything. Then I said I'm going to shoot you. Can't you hear?
Yeah, I heard you.
Then why are you grabbing onto me still? You back up. You're the one who's hurting right here. In front of you.
Let's back up.
There's like a crowd of people.
Oh. Hey, chill, bro.
Let's off it.
Hey, bro, chill. He's a kid.
Oh, vete a la verga. Chingue su madre. What the fuck? Vente más para atrás y no nos van a querer agarrar.
So you were able to hear the parts of the verbal altercation. I think you could hear the reference to that despicable term that Ferguson used in describing a 13-year-old female child. More importantly, you got to hear the verbal back and forth about shoot versus sue. I'm going to show you a few photographs. This is at the earlier stages of the proceeding, and this is when Mr. Ferguson kicks John Doe in the groin area. This is when John Doe number 2 is trying to kind of stop from Mr. Ferguson from maintaining his hold on John Doe, and he's physically putting his hand on both Mr. Ferguson and John Doe. This is now the individual with the red backpack is the individual. This is John Doe 3 who tackled Ferguson, and this is another view showing you John Doe 3 tackling Ferguson as John Doe 2 is talking to him and trying to get him to stop holding on to John Doe. This is another angle of that tackle that took Mr. Ferguson over the hedge to the other side of the residence. This is one of the angles showing John Doe 2 throwing a punch at Mr. Ferguson. And at the same time, you can see John Doe 4 about to jump over the hedge. This is that punch that landed on Mr. Ferguson's face. And this is another angle again showing John Doe 2 about to punch Mr. Ferguson in the face. And as you can tell, at the same time, Mr. Ferguson is maintaining his hold on John Doe. He doesn't want to let go of John Doe. And here is where the punch was landed. Again, another angle showing Mr. Ferguson getting punched in the face by John Doe 2. This is John Doe 4 as he's jumping over the hedge. And you will see immediately after he jumps, he reaches out behind his ear where he had what appears to be a pen or a pencil. Then he grabs it. At the same time, you can see Mr. Ferguson trying to bring John Doe over the hedge. He wanted to maintain control over him to continue to effectuate the detention he was trying to put in place. And now you can see John Doe 4 and Mr. Ferguson. This is after the punch, after the tackling. They're about 4 or 5 feet away, and you can see John Doe 4 reaching towards the back of his pants, the back pocket. We know now why he was doing that. He was putting his pen or his pencil in his back pocket. And this is the time that you see Mr. Ferguson looking directly at him and then reaching for his gun to grab his gun. And you can see actually John Doe 4 takes a step closer towards Mr. Ferguson, and Mr. Ferguson continues in his motion to grab his handgun. And now again, he's taken out his handgun, Mr. Ferguson, at the same time as John Doe Ford again still approaching him with his hand behind his back. It's another angle showing now John Doe Ford, who wasn't armed, he had a pencil in his back pocket, realizes, oops, Mr. Ferguson is bringing out a gun. This is another angle. I think it's a better picture. We wanted to make sure that you see it. The individual that you see with the red backpack, that's John Doe 3. That's the one who tackled Mr. Ferguson. And John Doe Ford is the one that's reaching towards the back pocket. And this is Mr. Ferguson getting the gun out. And this is here the picture that shows you, I think, as clear as humanly possible from the video, Mr. John Doe Ford reaching towards his back pocket, putting the pencil away or the pen away. And now you have Mr. Ferguson looking at him, and he's grabbing his weapon as John Doe Ford is approaching him. Now the weapon is out. John Doe Ford starts moving away. And it's around this time that the weapon was discharged. Mr. Ferguson had the gun in his left hand, and it was pointed in a downward direction. And witnesses that were interviewed by the Anaheim PD indicated that the gun was pointed in a downward direction at the time of the shooting. The letter that you're going to have, and I'm sure you have it by now, that we issued detailing our finding indicate what the Anaheim Police Department was able to find in their attempt to find the projectile. This is when the police arrived and they detained both individuals and they started their investigation. As we go through the law, and the details of the law are in the letter, I'm not going to go through all the specific detail. Our analysis relating to the ability of the Orange County District Attorney's Office to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ferguson did not have a legal right to detain John Doe was not in connection with trespassing. Our analysis was not that did he have a right or did he not have a right to arrest or detain John Doe for trespassing. It was for the potential crime of violating Penal Code Section 422, criminal threats, the notion of I'm going to shoot you versus I'm going to sue you. So that's the legal analysis that we undertook. The law in Penal Code Section 837 makes it clear that a private person, we're not talking about a police officer, we are talking about a private person. Any private person may arrest another individual for a public offense. Public offense includes a misdemeanor. A violation of Penal Code Section 422 can be either a misdemeanor or a felony. So the ability of a private person, private citizen, to place somebody under private person's arrest encompasses a public offense, which includes a violation of 422 as a misdemeanor. The law allows a physical detention to effect an arrest. The law is fairly clear in stating that a private person, we're not talking about a police officer, we're talking about a private person. A private person is allowed under the law to use force in effectuating a physical detention. However, that force must be reasonable under the circumstances. So the private person is allowed to use reasonable force in effectuating a private person's arrest. The law also provides that if that force used by the individual is excessive or not reasonable under the circumstances, if the prosecutor can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, that will justify the filing of criminal charges. The law is very clear. This is not just about a police officer. It is very important from our perspective, from the Orange County District Attorney's Office. We did not evaluate the case looking at Mr. Ferguson as a police officer trying to arrest John Doe. We evaluated this case as Mr. Ferguson, private citizens, trying to effectuate what the law allows private citizens to do, a private person's arrest. The law is fairly clear in stating that when a peace officer or a private citizen employs reasonable force to make an arrest, the arrestee, the person being arrested, is obliged not to resist and has no right of self-defense against such force. The person being arrested has no right of self-defense against a reasonable force to effectuate a private person's arrest. And obviously, a private person's arrest, as well as a police officer's ability to use self-defense from an apparent or an actual danger is the same. You and I now know that when John Doe Ford was reaching behind his back, he was not reaching for a weapon. He was putting a pencil away. However, the law allows a person to make a determination for the right to use force in self-defense based on the appearance of danger, even if, unfortunately, like this case, the danger was not actual. It was an apparent danger. Our analysis really focused on two main questions. Can we prove beyond a reasonable doubt, can the Orange County DA's office prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ferguson did not have a legal right to detain John Doe? And the second part of our analysis, can the Orange County District Attorney's Office prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ferguson used unreasonable force under the circumstances? We did this analysis, and our conclusion, we want to start with what's probably obvious to most reasonable people that watch this video. What Mr. Ferguson did was unwise, was immature. There's no question about that. What Mr. Ferguson did, flat out, there is no question about that, endangered and terrified a 13-year-old child. There's no question about that. There's also no question about the fact that Mr. Ferguson's action endangered the safety of a bunch of students that were trying to help John Doe. Now, did one of them punch Mr. Ferguson? Yes, we took that into account. But the conclusion that most reasonable people will reach is that the conduct of Mr. Ferguson on that day, under these circumstances, did endanger a large group of juveniles. The tough question that we had to answer, though, is can we prove this beyond a reasonable doubt to be able to file criminal charges against Mr. Ferguson? And it is our office's conclusion, based on all the evidence, that we are not able to prove. The evidence does not support a finding beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ferguson committed a crime in connection with his interaction with Mr. John Doe. As a result of that, our office concluded that we will not be filing criminal charges, and our criminal review and criminal analysis in connection with this case has now been completed. And I'll turn it back to Mr. Rokakis.
So I don't think anybody who watches this video or series of videos can look at it and think that that it was okay, that what Mr. Ferguson did was okay. We're just not able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt any crimes against him, and I think the analysis made that very clear. So at this point, we'll be open to questions. I think that there's a microphone. We'll be asking you to speak or ask questions into the microphone so that we can hear it both ways. And this gentleman here has a question.
Two questions. Do we know if Mr. Ferguson, the shot he fired was intentional? Sorry,
So the question is, do we know if that shot fired was intentional? We don't actually know that, except that what Mr. Ferguson said it was. But looking at you can't tell, I don't think, by looking at the video.
I think you said that he said it was a warning shot. Are warning shots legal?
Yes, under the right circumstances, of course they're legal. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Tony Mitchell, Julie, KCAL 9 CBS 2. I assume as part of this you do speak to the families of the teenagers involved. What sort of conversation did you have with them, briefing them about your decision, and what was their reaction?
Brahim?
You are correct. As part of the process that we go through, we obviously, the Anaheim Police Department interviewed the juvenile, but we did notify them this morning. They have legal representation, and it is our ethical duty when somebody has an attorney, we go through their attorney. So we did contact the attorney, and we told the attorney about our process and the fact that we're finishing our process, reaching a conclusion today. So that, yes, before you heard about our conclusion, we did contact the attorney representing John Doe.
And was there anything that he said?
Respectfully, I'm going to just let him or her tell you whatever they wish to tell you about their reaction.
Tony Gregory, ABC 7. There was a lot of unrest when this incident first occurred, a lot of anger towards Anaheim PD regarding not making an arrest. And surely there will be some unrest today because of this decision. Anything you want to say in regards to Anaheim PD's decision in February not to make an arrest, as well as to some of those folks today that are unhappy with this decision?
Well, I think that that this situation occurred is really unfortunate. I mean, we're looking at a circumstance where there's some kids going home from school or they walk across, or somebody walks across Mr. Ferguson's property. Apparently, he's had issues with that over time, and determined to make to make something out of it, to try to stop these kids from encroaching on his property. And I think, I think we all understand that's a pretty unreasonable position to take. If you live close to a school, there's a lot of kids walking home, or going back and forth, walking home, walking to school. They're gonna walk on your property. They're gonna walk on your lawn. I mean, that's just a normal part of what we go through, having neighborhoods. And if there's some, I think it might be, if you want to protect your lawn to that extent, maybe you ought to put a fence around it or something to try to make it more obvious that you want to keep the kids off. So that behavior, going out there and yelling at the kids and threatening them and that sort of thing, is not good behavior. And those kids are going to act the way they acted. I mean, they're they're juvenile. They're junior high school kids. I think watching the video, I think you can be impressed that it doesn't look like they really did anything. It doesn't look like they really did anything wrong. I mean, they're out there with their friends. They're seeing all this take place. They're not certainly not in their mind convinced that this Mr. Ferguson has any right to be detaining this kid or arresting him or taking him any place. So their behavior is really, I think, given all the circumstances, pretty restrained. I mean, they didn't mob him or anything. They were watching. They were keeping their distance for the most part. And in time, they got a little closer and got a little more, you might say, aggressive, trying to help their friend get free of this Mr. Ferguson. So when the police arrived, and they listened to both sides, frankly, they didn't really have an arrest that they could make. Mr. Ferguson explains that this kid said he was going to shoot him, and that gives somebody a right to make a citizen's arrest. You heard the analysis, and the kids say what they saw, and it's a situation that came up that is it's unfortunate, and it should have never happened, and we're not happy that this occurred. So I don't know what else to say. I think that I don't see how the police could make an arrest rightfully in that situation.
Hi, Chris and Carlo with KFI. My question, I apologize if this is redundant and it's multitasking there, but is there a possibility,
where are you? Raise your hand. I'm trying to.
Right,
oh, here we are.
yeah,
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm looking around. Okay, all right.
Was there ever the prospect of child endangerment charges? I mean, we just heard the discussion that the kids were put in danger. Why not those sort of charges?
Oh, we wouldn't be able to prove that either. The question is whether or not we could bring charges for a child endangerment. That wouldn't that wouldn't fly either. I mean, for all the same reasons why we can't bring a case against Mr. Ferguson. In his view, he thinks somebody threatened to shoot him. He's trying to make a citizen's arrest. It's not going to work that we can then prosecute him for child endangerment. That would never be supported by evidence. I do agree with the objective facts as stated by Brahim Beitai that the effect of it was pulling the gun and firing the gun. I mean, the effect of that is putting everybody around in danger. But we would not be able to show that Mr. Ferguson was, in fact, acting unlawfully, that beyond a reasonable doubt that he was acting unlawfully under the circumstances.
Hi, Sandra Endo, Channel 11, right here.
Yes.
I know the investigation was under the premise that this was a citizen's arrest, that he was a citizen making an arrest, but did he have the onus or should he or at any time did he identify he was a police officer? And if you could also mention if any of the kids were charged or arrested and what those charges would be.
None of the kids were charged with anything or arrested. I don't believe that at any time that he said he was a police officer, but let me ask Mr. Baite just to clarify that.
There was a part of, very briefly, and you can actually hear it on a video, where he says, I'm a police officer, and you can hear the kid saying back that, I don't know that you're a cop, I'm not believing that you're a cop. But just what's important from our perspective, in our analysis, we did not review this as this is a police officer and did he commit a crime acting as a police officer. We did not give him that additional benefit. Because when somebody acting as a police officer, the law provides for additional safeguards about their ability to use force. We treated that as any individual in the community trying to do what Mr. Ferguson was doing. But there was a portion of the time when on the video you can actually hear Mr. Ferguson say something to the effect that I'm a cop, and the kid, John Doe, says, well, I don't know that you're a cop, or I'm not believing that you're a cop.
As a police officer, does he have to identify himself as a police officer even though he's acting off duty?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, police officers sometimes act undercover. They don't have a responsibility to tell people that they're cops. But for our legal analysis, we treated him as a John Doe citizen trying to effectuate a private person's arrest. The other part of your question, during the 911 call, when Ferguson is talking to the dispatcher, there is also an indication that he's a cop, the terminology that he uses, and it asks him to come there immediately.
I'm John Beard, KNX Radio. Just wanted to ask you, did Ferguson ever say specifically why he fired the shot? Did he say, because even in your report, you say the crowd was converging on him, and when I first saw the video months ago, it looked like they were getting closer and closer. Or was it because the guy with the hand behind the back, did he say anything?
He just said he fired a warning shot. I don't believe he said anything in addition to that. That was it. He said, I fired a warning shot. Yes, question back here. Wait a second. You're going to get a mic right now on your other side. There we go. Yes, sir.
Don Benedict's Courthouse News. John Doe filed a lawsuit in June against both counties and police departments, and in that said that he was arrested. But you're saying no one was arrested?
Well, you can see the detention.
I'm sorry?
There's a detention. That could be referred to as an arrest. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We always have to be very careful when we are talking about juveniles, because records relating to juveniles and detaining juveniles and arresting juveniles are protected under the law. So what Mr. Rukaka is referring to, initially he was detained at the scene. As far as what happens after that, we are respectfully not going to talk about that from our perspective, because we consider that as being protected under the Welfare and Institution Code.
Hi, I'm Ann Doe from the LA Times. I'm curious about having spent several hours the day of the shooting or the altercation in the neighborhood. A lot of the neighbors said, even from the day after, they still see a lot of students going back and forth and going near his property. Have you heard anything about that? And does he still live there today?
As far as your first part of the question, I think what Mr. Rukaka said is absolutely applicable. People that live near schools, there's going to be issues about that. The criminal justice system and what the DA's office is not the way we solve it. We don't file charges on people to resolve a problem of people walking on other people's lawns. So whether or not that problem still exists, that's not part of what we do. As far as the second part, I'm going to respectfully refer you to the LAPD as far as his current status with the LAPD as a peace officer.
I have another question, James with KBC Radio. Will this incident be used or should be used as an example for adults and children who may have a similar problem of their own?
Why these videos are available, and I think that it certainly could be used as a teaching moment. We don't have any plans at this time to take them to schools or do anything like that. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Was there another question?
One more question, should be KTLA. Can you talk about real quick the timeline as far as when the phrase was uttered, I'm going to sue you or I'm going to shoot you, the confusing phrase, was that, just to clarify, did that precede him grabbing the kid and holding on to him? And secondly, was there any look into whether or not he reasonably believed that kid had a gun? Because I didn't hear in any of the videos him asking, where's the gun? Do you have a gun?
Okay, so we got two separate questions. One about when was the phrase, I'm going to shoot or sue you, when did that occur? And then the next was about John Doe. Was there any inquiry or was there any further investigation about whether or not there was a reasonable belief that John Doe 4 had a gun?
And does that play into the decision, or is it just the fact that he said it gives him the right to hold it?
All right, I'm going to leave that to Ibrahim.
As far as the first question, clearly, and we were able to establish that beyond any doubt in our mind, the statement was uttered before the physical altercation started. So that statement was uttered, and that was the statement that, based on all the evidence that we have, that triggered Mr. Ferguson trying to pursue John Doe to try to detain him and place him under private person's arrest. It was that statement. Even the verbal back and forth between Mr. Ferguson and John Doe establishes that. As far as the second part of the question, that's why it takes us time to review these cases. Mr. Ferguson did not give us a detailed statement. We know what we have on the video, and we have the statement he gave to the police initially. We have to make our analysis based on the evidence that we have. And the evidence that we have is the moment that he reached out and took out his gun was the time that John Doe 4 was approaching him with his hand towards his back. We have to look at that evidence to say, if we charge Mr. Ferguson with a crime, any crime, whether it's child endangerment, assault, battery, assault with a deadly weapon, can we disprove beyond a reasonable doubt that he did not think the guy had a gun in his hand? And our conclusion is that we clearly cannot, and I believe the evidence clearly shows that.
Well, lastly, does it play into your decision, your charging decision at all, that from what you've said, it sounds like the officer set all this in motion with his vulgarity towards the young girl? Does that play into it, that it appears he set this whole event in motion with that?
Vulgarity is not, it's not good conduct, and it's not professional conduct, it's not wise conduct, and it's not mature conduct. However, it's not a defense for a threat. So just because I use vulgarity against an individual, that's not a defense for that individual to commit a crime against me by threatening me. So yes, it does factor into our analysis, but it's not determinative. It's not the end of the inquiry, it's just one of the factors.
Raheem Michelle here, one more question, please. If the bullet had hit one of these teenagers, would that have changed this case?
So, respectfully, that's a situation that we're not in, and I think it's really good that the bullet didn't hit anyone, and so fortunately we don't have to review that. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your time.